wind howled through the Appalachian Mountains on a bitter cold night in Fayetteville, West Virginia. It was a darkness that felt heavy and oppressive, like a thick woolen blanket suffocating the small town. The year was 1945, and the world was just beginning to heal from the scars of a global war. But for one family, the horror was only just beginning to take root. The Sodder home stood as a beacon of warmth and light against the snowy backdrop. Inside, laughter and the rustling of wrapping paper filled the air. Little did they know that this festive cheer would soon be replaced by a screaming inferno that would consume their lives and birth a mystery that refuses to die. George Sodder was a man of strong will and even stronger opinions. He had built a life for himself and his large family in this coal mining community after immigrating from Italy. He was a hard worker who owned his own trucking company and provided well for his wife Jenny and their 10 children. However, George was not a man to stay silent when he saw injustice. His vocal criticism of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had earned him enemies within the local immigrant community. There were whispers in the shadows and cold stares in the market. Some men warned him that his words would bring ruin upon his house. But George refused to be intimidated by the threats of lesser men. The autumn months leading up to that fateful Christmas were filled with strange occurrences that seemed insignificant at the time. A stranger had appeared at the back door of the home, asking about hauling work. As he walked away, he pointed a finger at the fuse boxes on the exterior wall. He commented ominously that the wiring would someday cause a fire. This was strange because the local power company had just inspected the house and declared the wiring in perfect condition. It felt like a subtle threat veiled as a casual observation. The man disappeared down the road, leaving George with a nagging sense of unease that he could not quite place. Another incident occurred shortly after, involving a man trying to sell life insurance to the family. When George declined the offer, the salesman became irate and aggressive. He shouted that the house would go up in smoke and the children would be destroyed. He claimed this punishment would be payment for the dirty remarks George had been making about Mussolini. George kicked the man off his property, but the words hung in the air like a curse. It was a specific and terrifying promise of violence that targeted the most vulnerable members of the Sodder clan. These were not idle threats, but foreshadowing of a doom that was slowly creeping toward their door. Despite the lingering tension, the Sodder family prepared for Christmas with joy and excitement. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread and pine needles. On Christmas Eve, the snow began to fall, gently covering the yard in a pristine white sheet. 9 of the 10 children were home that night, while the eldest son served in the military. The younger children were thrilled with the holiday atmosphere and begged their mother to let them stay up late to play with their new toys. Jenny agreed they could stay up until midnight, as long as they completed their chores before going to bed. The house felt safe and secure against the winter night. The living room was warm and glowing from the fireplace as the younger children played on the rug. Morris and Martha, along with their younger siblings, Louis and Jenny, and little Betty, enjoyed the freedom of the late hour. The parents, George and Jenny, along with the toddler Sylvia, retired to their bedroom upstairs. The older boys, John and George Jr., were already asleep in the attic room. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, the silence of the countryside descended upon the house. It was a peaceful scene that masked the tragedy waiting in the wings. The children were happy and safe in the only home they had ever known. At 12:30, the sharp ring of the telephone shattered the silence. Jenny woke up startled and hurried downstairs to answer it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lifted the receiver. On the other end was a woman whose voice she did not recognize. The stranger asked for a person whose name was unfamiliar. In the background, Jenny could hear the clinking of glasses and raucous laughter, suggesting a party. When Jenny stated it was the wrong number, the woman laughed in a strange and high-pitched tone that sent a chill down Jenny's spine. She hung up the phone and returned to bed feeling deeply unsettled by the bizarre interaction. As Jenny walked back through the house, she noticed that the lights were still on downstairs and the curtains were not drawn. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual because the children were always diligent about their chores. She assumed the children had simply forgotten in their excitement and gone to sleep in the attic. She locked the door and turned off the lights before returning to her room. As she began to drift back to sleep, she heard a loud, heavy thud on the roof. It sounded like something hard hitting the shingles, followed by a rolling noise. She listened for a moment, but hearing nothing else, she closed her eyes. Around 1 a.m, Jenny woke again to the smell of smoke. She sat up and realized the room was filling with a gray haze. Rushing into the hallway, she saw that the office off the living room was engulfed in flames. The fire was not burning naturally, but seemed to be roaring with an unnatural intensity. She screamed for George, and they began to mobilize. The priority was to get the children out of the house immediately. George and Jenny grabbed the toddler Sylvia and ran out into the snowy night. They were joined by the older boys, John and George Jr., who had escaped from the attic just in time. Outside in the freezing air, the horror of the situation became clear. The house was burning rapidly, and the fire was climbing the walls toward the attic, where the other 5 children slept. George screamed their names, but there was no answer from the upper floor. He knew he had to act fast to save them. He ran to the side of the house, hoping to climb through the attic window. He expected to find his ladder, which was always kept in the same spot against the wall. To his absolute horror, the ladder was missing. He searched frantically in the dark, but it was nowhere to be found. Desperation took over as George devised a new plan. He would use one of his coal trucks to pull up beneath the window and climb onto the roof of the cab. He ran to the first truck and jumped into the driver's seat. He turned the key, but the engine sputtered and refused to start. This was impossible because the truck had been working perfectly just hours before. He jumped out and ran to the second truck, praying for a miracle. He turned the ignition, but was met with the same silence. Both trucks, which were meticulously maintained, had been disabled. It felt as if a dark hand was holding them back, preventing any rescue. The fire continued to rage, consuming the timber frame of the house with terrifying speed. Jenny tried to call the fire department from the neighbor's house, but she could not get through to the operator. Another neighbor saw the flames and drove to a nearby tavern to call for help. But again, there was no response. Finally, someone drove directly to the fire chief in town. Despite the fire department being only 2 miles away, the response was agonizingly slow. The minutes ticked by like hours as the parents watched their home turn into a funeral pyre. The screams of the parents echoed in the valley, but the attic remained silent. George tried to scoop water from the rain barrel to throw onto the flames, but the water was frozen solid. Every attempt to save his children was thwarted by cruel circumstance or sabotage. The heat became unbearable, forcing the family back from the structure. They stood in the snow, helplessly watching the roof collapse with a sickening crash. The attic floor gave way, and the entire house fell into the basement. By the time the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, nothing remained of the Sodder home but a smoking pile of ash and a brick chimney standing like a tombstone. The fire department finally arrived around 8 in the morning long, after the fire had burned itself out. The fire chief seemed unconcerned with the delay and offered weak excuses. The family waited with bated breath as the men began to sift through the ashes. They expected to find the remains of the 5 missing children. Morris and Martha and Louis and Jenny and Betty had to be in there. However, as the debris was cleared, a shocking truth emerged. There were no bones. There were no teeth. There was absolutely no trace that 5 human bodies had been in the fire. The coroner was quick to convene an inquest and declared the deaths accidental, caused by faulty wiring. He claimed that the fire was so hot it had completely incinerated the bodies, leaving nothing behind. George Sodder knew this was a lie. He had worked with coal fires his entire life and knew that bones do not simply vanish, even in the most intense heat. He visited a local crematorium to ask questions. The experts there told him that even after burning a body at 2,000 degrees for 2 hours, major bones remain intact. The house had burned to the ground in less than 45 minutes. The funeral service was a hollow and surreal event. The family had to mourn over empty caskets, while questions swirled in their minds. George could not shake the feeling that his children were still alive. He began to piece together the strange events of that night. The missing ladder was found days later, thrown down a steep embankment away from the house. It was clear that someone had moved it intentionally. The trucks that would not start were inspected, and it was discovered that the wires had been cut. This was not an accident or faulty wiring. This was a calculated attack designed to trap the family. George also investigated the phone line. The phone company technician revealed that the line had not been burned through by the fire, as initially thought. Instead, the wire had been cut cleanly with pliers at the top of the pole. The person who did this had to climb the pole to sever the connection, ensuring no help could be called. This required skill and planning. It was not the act of a random arsonist. The pieces of the puzzle pointed to a coordinated effort to destroy the house and potentially kidnap the children. The thought that his children might be out there somewhere gave George a new purpose. Reports began to trickle in from people who claimed to have seen the children. A woman operating a tourist stop 50 miles away said she served breakfast to the children on Christmas morning. She described a car with Florida license plates and several men and women accompanying the kids. She noted that the adults were speaking Italian and seemed hostile, preventing the children from talking to her. Another witness claimed to have seen the children watching the fire from a passing car while the house was still burning. These sightings fueled the hope that the children had been stolen in the night. George and Jenny dedicated their lives to finding the truth. They hired private investigators to track down leads across the country. One investigator named C.C. Tinsley discovered that the fire chief had found a human heart in the ashes and buried it in a box. George confronted the chief, who admitted to hiding the box. When they dug it up and sent it for analysis, it turned out to be fresh beef liver. It had never been in a fire. The chief had planted it to make the family believe the children were dead and stop the investigation. This betrayal only deepened the mystery. The family printed thousands of flyers with pictures of the missing children and offered a large reward for information. They traveled to different states, chasing rumors and leads, but always came up empty-handed. In 1952, they erected a large billboard on Route 16 near the site of the fire. It featured the photos of the 5 children and a list of the suspicious evidence. It became a haunting landmark for travelers, a constant reminder of the tragedy and the unsolved crime. The billboard stood for decades, fading under the sun, but the faces of the children remained clear. Years turned into decades, and the pain never dulled. Jenny Sodder wore black every day as a sign of mourning, but she continued to tend her garden where the house once stood. She planted flowers in the depression of the basement turning the site of horror into a memorial. The family never rebuilt on the site, choosing to leave it as a testament to their lost loved ones. They sat by the phone waiting for a call that would explain everything, but the silence was deafening. The local police and the FBI closed the case, leaving the family to fight alone. In 1967, over 20 years after the fire, a letter arrived in the mail addressed to Jenny. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, and contained no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young man who looked to be in his mid-20s. On the back of the photo, a cryptic message was written. It read, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illil boys, a 90132 or 35. The resemblance to their missing son Louis was striking. The eyes and the nose and the shape of the face matched perfectly. It was the first solid proof they had seen in years. George hired another private investigator to go to Kentucky and find the man in the photo. The investigator took the money and left, but he was never heard from again. He vanished just like the children, taking the hope of the family with him. The Sodders were afraid to publish the photo, fearing that if it was Louis, the kidnappers might harm him. They added the image to the billboard, hoping someone would recognize him, but no credible leads ever surfaced. The photo remained a taunting glimpse of a life that might have been lived in secret. The psychological toll on George and Jenny was immense. They spent their fortunes searching for answers that never came. George died in 1969, his heart broken by the loss and the endless mystery. Jenny continued to wear black and maintain the billboard until her death in 1989. The surviving children and grandchildren continued the search, but the trail had gone cold. The house site was eventually bulldozed, and the billboard was taken down, leaving only the wind to whisper through the trees where the children once played. To this day, theories abound about what happened to the Sodder children. Some believe the local mafia took them in retaliation for George's criticism of Mussolini. Others think they were sold into an illegal adoption ring. Some darker theories suggest a personal vendetta by a family member or neighbor. The lack of physical evidence at the fire scene remains the most damning proof that they did not die there. 5 children do not simply turn to dust, leaving no trace. They were taken. They were moved. They were hidden away. The story of the Sodder children is not just a tragedy of a fire, but a ghost story of the most psychological kind. It is a story of faces in windows and voices on the phone. It is the story of a family haunted not by the dead, but by the living. The image of those 5 children staring out from the billboard burned itself into the collective memory of the town. They became the ghosts of Christmas past, frozen in time, forever young and forever missing. The evil that visited the Sodder home that night was human and calculated. Even now, if you visit Fayetteville on a cold winter night, you might feel the weight of the mystery. The wind still howls through the valley, carrying the secrets of 1945. The site of the house is overgrown, but the earth remembers. The cut wires and the missing ladder and the silent trucks are pieces of a nightmare that actually happened. The true horror lies in the uncertainty, knowing that your children might be alive somewhere calling out for you, while you mourn a grave that does not exist. Is a torture worse than death? The legacy of the Sodder children serves as a grim reminder that safety is an illusion. We lock our doors and trust our neighbors, but darkness can still find a way in. The fire that destroyed their home was just the beginning of the torment. The real fire was the burning question that consumed the parents for the rest of their lives. Where are they? The answer remains hidden in the smoke of that Christmas Eve, lost to history and silence. As the years pass, the likelihood of solving the case diminishes to zero. The witnesses are dead and the evidence is gone, but the faces of Morris and Martha and Louie and Jenny and Betty refuse to fade. They stare out from the black and white photographs, demanding to be remembered. They are the vanished, the stolen, the lost, and in the quiet hours of the night, when the snow falls on the mountains, you can almost hear their laughter cut short by a flame that should never have been lit. The story ends not with a resolution, but with a lingering dread. The evil that took them was never caught. The people who cut the wires and planted the liver and stole the children walked free. They lived their lives while the Sodders lived in hell. It is a chilling thought that monsters walk among us, wearing the faces of neighbors and strangers. The Sodder children are gone, but the darkness that took them remains waiting for the next unlocked door on a silent winter night.